Welcome to this edition of Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm DP Lyle. Today, I want to talk about an unusual case and an unusual group of people and a little bit of medical science. I ran across this article that was about an attempted murder. Robert Frost in Mending Wall famously said, "Good fences make good neighbors." And I think Keith Monroe, who lived in Texas, may agree. It seems that he lived next door to a guy named Ryan Sauter. Uh, and I use the term live next door. They had their RVs parked next to each other. And a dispute broke out, and these two neighbors didn't get along. Well, Mr. Sauter decided that he was going to seek his revenge and he was going to attack his neighbor. Now, people commit murders or attempt murders for a lot of different reasons. I talked about this in an earlier podcast in this series. I think it was actually the first one. But they're for reasons like financial gain and revenge and anger and lust and to cover another crime. And the motives go on and on and on. Often we don't understand why people do what they do. Sometimes it's very clear, as in he needed killing, but those aren't the usual. Often we're perplexed. It always has seemed strange to me that spouses can't spell the word divorce, and they would rather have the spouse killed than walk away from a marriage. But it happens all the time, and people decide to use all sorts of weapons when they commit murders or attempt murders. Guns and knives, of course, poisons, explosives, strangulations, drownings. They push people off buildings and off cliffs, and they can come up with all kinds of unusual ways and creative ways to kind of off someone else. Well, Ryan Sauter came up with a very unusual method. He decided to use a snake, a rattlesnake. And he was going to slip it into his neighbor's RV, and hopefully the snake would bite him and the neighbor would die and the dispute would be resolved. Okay. Here's the problem with rattlesnakes is they make noise. They buzz. Unless you really walk up on one very quickly and surprise it, it's going to make a noise to warn you away because snakes are not really all that confrontational. They would rather run away, they would rather hide, and they will only strike you if you surprise them. But confined in an RV, that would likely happen. So Mr. Sauter came up with a very clever way of silencing, if you will, this snake. He bit the rattle off. Yeah, that's what he did. And then he put the snake in the RV. Well, fortunately, Mr. Monroe saw the snake as he climbed in and avoided being struck. And of course, Mr. Sauter was then hauled off to jail. And I'm assuming this case is still pending. But this is kind of an unusual way of attempting a murder. You can't make this stuff up. Now, snake bites aren't always the result of criminal activity. In fact, they rarely are. That's probably not a standard approach for murder. As I said before, guns and knives and poisons work a whole lot better, baseball bats and hammers and things like that. But snakes have been used. Now, I grew up in the South, and any hunter or hiker or whatever can tell you that that snakes are out there, but most of the bites occur accidentally. Now, we stomped around in the woods as kids all the time, constantly. Me and my buddies with our BB guns, and we would go stomping around. I mean, it was a daily activity during the summer, of course, but also after school. That's where we hung out, and we would go hiking in the woods and shoot our BB guns and solve the mysteries of life. Well, so we knew snakes pretty well, and because you would run up on them and you knew how to avoid them and you knew where they were likely going to hide. And snakes are not always poisonous. In fact, most of them are harmless. There's only, I think, 4 poisonous snakes in the United States, but some of them are scary anyway. I mean, until you've stepped up on what we call a black racer, these are thin black snakes that are hard to see. They don't rattle. They don't do anything. They don't bite you. They run away, and they run away very, very, very fast. You're walking along in the woods and you hear it's gone through the brush. I mean, lightning fast. That was a black racer. Um, but there are others, particularly in the South, rattlesnakes and copperheads. Rattlesnakes are of many different varieties, and a copperhead is a type of rattler. A copperhead is actually a very pretty snake. It's coppery colored. It's got a neat scale pattern. What's interesting about copperheads is their poison is not quite as deadly as that of rattlesnakes. And in fact, if you weigh over about 70, 80 pounds, a copperhead's not likely to kill you. It can make you sick, but it's not likely to kill you. Rattlesnake's a different story. They're dangerous. And until you've seen a water moccasin or cottonmouth, as we call them, you don't know what snakes are. These are nasty, ugly, scary creatures. They hang around water. You find them, you see them swimming through the water all the time, and yes, they can bite you in the water. Many times out fishing with my dad, we would see them that actually come right up under the boat. They're thick and they're dark, kind of blackish, brownish, grayish. They're very prehistoric looking. They have a very angry looking face, big fangs, and they will bite you. They're aggressive. They're just scary looking snakes, and you do not want to mess with them. In the South, we always had things you call swimming holes. That date back hundreds of years, and they're places where creeks and streams and whatnot kind of widen and deepen, and so there's an area where the water is slower. Water's coming in from one end and out the other, and people jump in those things and go swimming, and they're called swimming holes. And you tie a rope to a tree limb and you swing out on it, and you land in the water, or you jump off a precipice of rock or something like that. Well, in the South, you learn very quickly before you do anything like that, you make a lot of noise and throw some rocks and beat some sticks. And in other words, you scare the water moccasins away before you jump in the swimming hole. And if not, you might suffer the consequences. Snake bites are unusual injuries. And the reason for this is that snake venom actually has two different components to it. One is an enzymatic component. It's an enzyme that eats tissue. And so when the snake bites and injects the venom, say in your leg, those enzymes go about destroying the tissues there. The skin, the subcutaneous areas, the muscles, they start digesting them, if you will. Then there's another toxin that is a more what we call systemic, which means throughout the body poison. And when this gets in the bloodstream, it starts causing its mischief, one of which is hemolyzing or destruction of the blood. So this is how snakes kill you. Well, this dichotomy in the way it works, both locally and systemically, really complicates the treatment. The old thing about cutting an X and sucking the poison out, no, you do not do that. Putting a tourniquet on, which you would think if you put a tourniquet on tight enough to restrict venous blood flow back into the body, not enough to obstruct arterial flow so the leg still is alive. You're not cutting off the blood supply of the leg, but it's tight enough to obstruct the venous flow so that the blood, that the toxin that mixes with the blood in the area of the bite doesn't get back into the bloodstream and spread through the body. It would make sense that would work. Well, actually what happens is it allows the part of the enzymatic part of the poison to stay in the area, and the tissue destruction becomes much, much, much greater. On the other hand, if you don't do that and you let it go, then it gets into the bloodstream faster and the systemic damage is done. So what are you going to do? Well, there's really only one thing: cut and run. Get to medical help as quickly as possible and get the antivenom. That's something that's given that ties up the venom so it can't work. It's an antigen antibody thing, with the antivenom being the antibody that ties up the toxin, neutralizes it, and so both the local and particularly the systemic things are shut down. So don't put a tourniquet on. Don't try to suck the poison out if you ever get bit by a snake. But snakes will avoid you if you let them know you're around. So stomp, make a lot of noise, and things like that. I've actually got struck by a snake once while playing golf. Someone had hit a ball into this brushy area, and I went in there to help look for it, and the snake hit my left ankle. Fortunately, it missed the skin, but I had two elliptical tears in the sock where the fangs had ripped through there. I knew instantly what it was as soon as it struck, and I kind of slung my leg to the left, and it went sailing down this hill. It was about a 2.5 foot young rattler. Um, so I got lucky, but a lot of people aren't. But there are other people who get bit by snakes because they're handling them. And I don't mean herpetologists and biologists and people who are studying snakes, though it happens to them also, but I'm talking about snake handling preachers. Yes, this is not just a remnant of the past. This exists today, even though in most states owning and handling snakes is illegal. But you get into that old state versus church conflict, and how do you prevent them from doing what they want to do and without violating their rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big controversy. It's been going on for a long, long, long time. But at the end of the day, there are churches who handle snakes. There are preachers who handle snakes, and they're from coast to coast. They're in California, they're in Appalachia, they're in West Virginia, they're in Alabama, they're everywhere. And there used to be many, many, many of them. There's fewer of them now, but they're still out there, and every now and then you will read about preachers getting bit. Now, in the show notes that are going to be attached to this, and if you go to my blog or website, they'll be there too. There's a lot of links to several of these preachers that have been bitten, and also there's even videos of these people handling snakes in their church services. My father always told a story that when he was about 5 years old, he grew up on a farm in rural Mississippi near Tupelo. And his mother took him to a church once. They called them holy rollers back then. But basically, it was snake handlers. They didn't know that at the time. And they go in there and they're singing and dancing and playing music, and everybody's having a good time. And then the preacher opens up a box and pulls out a snake. Well, my grandmother went insane, and she basically grabbed my dad, who was 5 at the time, and handed him out the window to a guy outside, and then she climbed out the window and they were gone. So that was my father's experience with these snake handling preachers. Well, how do they justify this? How do they justify handling snakes? What's the dictums that promote this activity? Well, most will cite Mark 16 verses 17 and 18, and it says, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak in new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Okay, so snake handling uses this to not only justify handling the snakes, but also the speaking in tongues that they will often do, and believe it or not, the drinking of strychnine. They believe sipping strychnine will not only make them stronger and better and more religious or whatever, but it's a good way to treat snake bites. That makes sense to me. Add one poison to another. Now, for the most part, most people trace snake handling churches back to about 1910, when a guy named George Went Hensley started incorporating them into his services at the Church of God with signs following. Remember, these signs shall follow them that believe. Well, that's where this church came from. And many others have come along later. Some of the famous ones were that have been bitten by their snakes were John Wayne Pumpkin Brown and Jamie Coots. There's, again, links if you go to the show notes to their stories. Also, Coots' son, Cody, was also bitten while preaching. But he was saved because his friends defied the dictates of the church and got him medical help, and he got the antivenom and survived. Other people aren't so lucky. So most often, though, when a preacher gets bit, he uses his faith and a little strychnine and figure that that the Lord's going to save him. Well, that doesn't always work out that way. Now, in my third Samantha Cody book, which is called Original Sin, I had a snake handling preacher in there, one of the bad guys. And so I started researching this a little bit further. I knew obviously a lot about snake bites and stuff and a lot about snakes, but I didn't know a whole lot about these churches. And that's where I discovered at that time, and this is probably a decade ago, that I started this research. There were 100 to 200 such churches across the country. I think there's a lot smaller number now. I don't exactly know what it is. But one of the things I ran across in my research, and I recommend this to you, was I stumbled across a book called Salvation on Sand Mountain. Now, what caught me about that is, first I was Googling snake handling preachers, is that Sand Mountain's maybe 30, 40 miles from where I grew up. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, and nearby is places like Scottsboro and Albertville and Boaz, and they're all up on what we call Sand Mountain. It's interesting that they make the best sorghum on the planet up there. You probably don't know what sorghum is, but it's kind of like a very rich syrup, and Sand Mountain sorghum is famous. Well, they're smaller towns. There's a lot of rural area around. It's a lot of wonderful farmland. Uh, they raise a ton of chickens up there. Uh, so when I saw this, I said, "Huh." So it was on Amazon, and so you can do that. Look inside. So I started reading it, and I was expecting this to be, kind of goofy and kind of a story, but maybe something interesting and whatever. But I started reading, and it was fantastic. The writing was unbelievable. And I thought, wow, this is not what I expected. So I backed out and looked. Well, I saw it was nominated for a National Book Award. Well, it was written by a guy named Dennis Covington. And I think that he was a reporter for the Birmingham News down in Birmingham, Alabama. And he went up there to research this case of Glenn Summerford, who was a snake handling preacher who attempted to kill his wife with a snake. Well, Dennis Covington and his wife actually got involved in the church and moved up there and were part of this church community for many months, if not a year or two, and finally extricated themselves. But they became fascinated with this whole thing, and you will too if you read this story. Well, Glenn Summerford basically set up to a snake to bite his wife and kill her, and he was convicted of this and went off to jail. So it just goes to show you that what goes around comes around. And so Mr. Sauter and Preacher Summerford aren't all that different. They were both using snakes as weapons of murder. In my book Original Sin, there's some great scenes in there that kind of cover this belief system. And of course, my preacher in there is a guy named John Scully, and he has his own belief system about how religion in the world works. But it incorporates a lot of this Mark 16 stuff and a lot of snake handling and signs following and all of those things. So there is a portion of that book that will be on the website and on my blog, along, like I said, with a lot of links. So at the end of the day, snakes are fascinating creatures. They have been around, obviously, forever. There are only 4 poisonous ones in the United States: rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmouths, and I did not mention coral snakes. And coral snakes are red and black and yellow ringed, very distinctive, but they also are very shy and very underground, and people don't encounter them very often, but they are present in the Southeast, particularly in Florida. And any southerner also knows this, because there are king snakes and other snakes that are red, black, and yellow ringed, and they're very bright colors. And there's a simple rhyme: red touches black is safe for Jack. Red touches yellow will kill a fellow. So if you see a red, black, and yellow striped snake, first of all, you're probably going to run away anyway, so it doesn't matter. But if you are concerned whether if it's poisonous or not, If the red is adjacent to the yellow, it's a coral snake. If the red is separated from the yellow by black, then it's probably a king snake or something like that. There are several others. So that little rhyme will help you. Red touches black is safe for Jack. Red touches yellow will kill a fellow. I talked about snake bite treatment and how difficult it can be sometimes. And then I talked about these churches. I've got you some links there, as I said, on the page on both my website and my blog. Go there and read more about this fascinating cultish religious following, as well as about snakes and some of these interesting cases. So until next time, this has been Criminal Mischief, the art and science of crime fiction, and today we talked about using snakes to kill people. Until next time, this is DP Lyle. I'll talk to you then.